Welcome to our 9 o'clock class on Sunday morning. We're glad you're here. We have some visitors with us, and we always welcome them as well. For those of you who are watching us by streaming, we're glad to have you as well. We're continuing our study of gospel personages. Jim said last week he was not familiar with the word personages. I have to take responsibility for putting that in the title, but at any rate, person sounded a little flat. Personages has a little flair to it. But at any rate, these are the people in the Gospels who stand out for us in special ways. I was just mentioning to Jim a moment ago because he's doing a Wednesday night class that he calls Portraits from John. How interesting it is that in doing this study, many of these people we're talking about have their stories almost entirely in the book of John. John somehow captures details that the synoptic writers did not seem to pick up on. And Nathanael is certainly a case in point today. We only have two major passages that deal with Nathanael. They're both from the book of John. One from the first chapter of John, one from the last chapter of John. It's as if John decided, let Nathanael be my bookends. He's at the beginning and he's at the ending. But we'll talk about him a little bit more in just a minute. I have to admit to you, as we continue this study, I've always been impressed with the study of the apostles themselves. I'm intrigued by them. I've made a habit of collecting as many books as I can find that deal with the apostles. Somehow they all seem to be rather repetitious because there's not a whole lot there, and so each writer says essentially the same thing the other writer said. I keep looking for something new and I haven't found it yet. But I have enjoyed that study, and I particularly like Nathanael. I think I have some identity with Nathanael because I think of him as a student, perhaps a scholarly person, one who is intent on spending time with the Word as he knew it then. And I think that is borne out in our lesson today. He offers us some insights into human weaknesses as well as strengths. He's a man who had to learn to cope with prejudice. And whether we like to admit it or not, most of us have to cope with prejudice in one form or the other. We make prejudgments, which is really what prejudice means. It's a prejudgment about a person or about his actions or his habits or even his beliefs. And we need to be very cautious about that. And Nathanael had to learn that lesson just as well. Well, as we begin looking at him today and thinking about him, Jim mentioned last week that there are 4 lists in the New Testament of all the apostles. One is in Matthew chapter 10, one is in Mark chapter 3, one's in Luke chapter 6, and then Luke repeats it in Acts chapter 1. Only John does not include a list of the apostles. And we sort of pick them up here, there, and everywhere, one at a time. As the writer of our lesson points out, we have a rather interesting kind of conundrum here with Nathanael. His name does not appear in any of the lists in the synoptics, nor in Acts. But there is a name in each of those lists that does not appear in John. His name is Bartholomew. And in all those lists of the apostles, Bartholomew always is paired with Philip. And so we get to John's account, and he talks about Philip finding Nathanael and bringing him to Jesus. The wheels begin turning. We think, well, maybe Bartholomew and Nathanael are the same person. That's one of the problems with some of the apostles. Some of them have multiple names. You get Thaddeus in one list, and he doesn't appear somewhere else. Who are these people? One writer speculates that Bartholomew is really a name for Bartomeah. Bar in Judaism, in Jewish language, means the son of. And he speculates that Nathanael is Nathanael Bartholomew, the son of Ptolemy. Could be. I don't know where we get all of our names. You remember, some folks are called Johnson. That means the son of John. So you look at those words that end with some, and that's kind of like the Jews turned it around and put some at the very beginning. Based on the 2 brief texts that we have concerning Nathanael from John chapter 1 and John 21, I think some very important lessons become evident. I'm going to read that first passage, and then we're going to break it down a little bit. From John chapter 1, and this is a great chapter, as we all know. We're introduced to who Jesus is. We're introduced to John the Baptist's influence. We're introduced to Andrew and John as they're introduced to Jesus. And then we get to a man named, and then we have Philip, and then we get to Nathanael. It's a chapter filled with names. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee. And he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered and said to him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You'll see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." The first thing that struck me in the passage is that John continues what is a major theme in this first chapter, and that is a theme of finding and following. Everywhere we run, we have somebody who found Jesus and who followed Jesus, and that certainly takes place with Nathanael. When Jesus went to Galilee, he found Philip, as if he had already been looking for him. John says Philip was from Bethsaida, and then adds that happens to be where Peter and Andrew were from. And you have to wonder if Peter and Andrew had already done some talking around Bethsaida about the one they discovered. After all, Andrew had gone to his brother Peter and said, "We found the Messiah." I doubt that that was held secret very long. People began to talk. Maybe Philip began to hear about it. So he is in that hometown of those two. Personal contacts continue all the way through this chapter. One calls another, one finds another, one invites another. And we've come to call that personal evangelism. And it's a powerful influence. The ability of one person to make an impression on a second person can never be minimized. Many of us are the result of a personal influence, somebody who took an interest in us and taught us or helped prepare us. When I was a young man, very young, 9, 10, 11, somewhere like that, a young man living next door to us, an adult, was already preaching. And we had a little class at church to help boys get up and make talks. Somewhere along the way we learned the difference between a talk and a sermon. But at any rate, I needed some help. And I asked this young man who lived next door to us, and he said, "I can help you work up a sermon." And he did. I wish I'd saved a copy of it. I remember what the theme was. He wanted me to do a lesson on putting first things first. That's not a bad topic. And he helped me find the right scriptures, and he helped me organize it, and even let me practice it. I shall always appreciate his influence, appreciate his interest in me. He could have just said, "I don't have time for you," but he didn't. He helped me prepare that little lesson. So one-on-one contacts can never be minimized. They always have complete value. It's interesting that when Philip finds Nathanael, he says, "We have found the Messiah." Who's we? Does that include Andrew and Peter? Probably so. It's not just I have, it's some of us. And since those two are from the same town where he lived, maybe they are the ones that are part of his we. He offers outstanding credentials for who Jesus is. He identifies him with two titles. He is the one that Moses and the prophets wrote about. You can't get any better than that. If in truth these people had been anticipating the Messiah, they were anticipating him based on the words of Moses, the words of the prophets, a message that was repeated over and over. Moses said, "There'll be one like me, you follow him." Moses even said, the one that comes is going to have similarities to me and what I've done. The prophets kept talking about the one that is to come, that Messiah. And so immediately Philip says, this is the one Moses and the prophets wrote about. He didn't just say, I think he's impressive, I enjoyed hearing him, you're going to like him, he has a good personality. No. This is the man who fulfills the promise of God. He is the one that Moses talked about, the prophets told about him over and over and over, and he's available. Here he is. But he said the second thing about him. He is Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. This is one of the few times in the Gospels where Jesus is referred to as the son of Joseph. Mary identifies him. She says of Joseph, he's your father. That's when Jesus responds, I have to be in my Father's house. Jesus makes a distinction. Mary did not. But here, Philip at least identifies him as the son of Joseph. Nathanael's response to what Philip has just said is intriguing. He does not respond to the name of Moses. He doesn't respond to the reference to the prophets. He doesn't respond to Joseph. But he does respond to Nazareth. Immediately he responds to Nazareth. Now we find out in John chapter 21, when we get to that second text, that Nathanael is from Cana of Galilee. Well, that name stands out in our minds. That's exactly where Jesus performed his first miracle. That's Nathanael's hometown. Cana is about 8 miles from Nazareth. They're neighbors. They might have been competitors. Little towns do that. You know, we're better than they are. You know, those people don't know as much as they think they do, kind of thing. Whatever it was that caused Nathanael to respond as he did about Nazareth, it opened a great deal of speculation. But there's something there that says Nathanael has made a prejudgment about Nathanael. And his impression is, you're not going to find anything good in Nazareth. He poses a question. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? I'm sure that in part, Nathanael might have been thinking, the prophet said he was going to come from Bethlehem. And he did. But he wonders how anybody could dare suggest that the Messiah would have come from Nazareth, that little way town. Nazareth is never mentioned in the Old Testament. I don't know if it's a new town, but never mentioned in the Old Testament. But suddenly Nathanael wonders what could come out of Nazareth that would attract anybody's attention. I've said this before. I grew up in Woodbine. People who wanted to disparage us in Woodbine called it Flat Rock. I never liked to be referred to as being in Flat Rock. That name didn't have any dignity. Woodbine sounded like a place with beautiful flowing plants or trees or whatever. Well, I kind of understand this notion here on Nathanael's part toward Nazareth. Prejudice, local pride. My, we do take pride in where we're from. You can see that in small towns throughout Middle Tennessee during any small football season. Local pride. And biblical knowledge figures in here somewhere too, because it's obvious to Nathanael that Nazareth is just not in the company of the Messiah. He was to come from Bethlehem, and so he did. Nathanael knew that. But I would suspect there were a lot of people in Nazareth who knew that too. The Messiah was supposed to come from Bethlehem. And so who is this carpenter's son who's suddenly talking about he's somebody important? We know better. And so John continues that interesting theme in the first of this book about people who meet Jesus and they go find somebody else and say, why don't you come see him? And then Jesus says, follow me. Following becomes, the word follow becomes a key word in the opening part of that chapter. But there's something second in all of this, and that is John introduces us to a series of attitudes. The attitude first of Nathanael who, as I said a moment ago, does not pick up on Moses and the prophets, just picks up on Nazareth. It's kind of an illustration of the reality that sometimes we hear only what we want to hear. Nathanael just shoves aside the idea that Moses and the prophets foretold this man. He's not interested in him because he's from Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? His question is not one for information. He knows that the Messiah could not come from Nazareth. How could he come from such an obscure place? How many times do you and I do that? We make a prejudgment about a place or about a person without ever knowing the facts. We look, we evaluate, we make a judgment, and we announce it as if it were final. I think it's interesting that Philip does not answer that question. He doesn't begin to sputter and say, well, you know, there are good things about him and you need to know what they are. He answers with the briefest response. Come and see. I won't explain it to you. I won't try to convince you. Come and see. It's interesting, Philip uses the same expression that Jesus uses when Andrew, and we presume John, asked, Master, where do you live? Jesus said, come and see. Investigate. You're not going to get the answers without spending some time yourself. So come and see. That's what Philip wants Nathanael to do. Come and see. Experiences are always, or almost always, more convincing than words. Following and seeing surely will have a greater influence than just what somebody else has told him. Luke stresses in his introduction to the book of Acts that his intention was to reveal all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. He wanted people to see the things Jesus had done. He wanted them to hear the words that he had said. So attitudes are important here, and notably the attitude of Nathanael that needed some direction, needed some guidance, and the best way to provide that is for him to come and see. And then we have another coming. I've said there are all these comings in chapter 1. Jesus saw Nathanael coming. He was doing exactly what Philip had said, come and see. So here he comes, and Jesus sees him and immediately makes an announcement about him. Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile or no deceit. Jesus complimented him. An Israelite, a son of Israel. He belongs to the Jewish nation. But there's something more than that. And Jesus is not just saying something obvious. Here's an unusual Israelite. There is nothing deceitful about him. I probably am going to stretch this point just a little bit, but I couldn't help thinking that when God changed Jacob's name to Israel, he didn't help his character in it all. Jacob is still noted for all of his deceit. The things he did with his father, with his brother, with his uncle. He was filled with deceitful acts. Maybe the Lord is saying, you're not really Jacob's descendant. There's no deceit in you. Paul discusses in the book of Romans 2 or 3 times, what is it that makes a Jew? And he says a Jew is not just from outward appearance, that is, circumcision. But the real Jew is from the heart. When Jesus says, behold, an Israelite in whom there's no guile, here's a person who's sincere. Here's a person who's honest, who doesn't practice any kind of guile or deceit. You can take him for who he is. He's honest. That's a great compliment. Honesty ought to be a hallmark of every Christian. My word is true. My actions are true. My feelings are true. All of that should be enough to depend upon. This is not the only time that Jesus cites a person's national heritage. When he first meets Zacchaeus, he calls him a son of Abraham. That should have made Zacchaeus feel good. Somebody who acknowledges this man's reputation, life, existence can be traced all the way back to Abraham. So you notice here, just in this one text, we have a reference to Moses, to the prophets, and then Jesus talks about Abraham in that passage in Luke chapter 19. Paul's statement, he is a Jew who is one inwardly, helps, I think, to explain what Jesus meant when he called him an Israelite. You can count on a man who's truthful and honest to offer no cover-up. He may be a descendant of Jacob, but he doesn't have to repeat Jacob's many examples of deceit. Psalm 15, a familiar psalm for all of us, poses the question, who can abide in your tabernacle? And the response is, he who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart, or the kinds of people God wants in his tabernacle, in his house, in his tent. He wants people who walk uprightly, people of integrity, people who work righteousness, concerned with good behavior and conduct, and who speak truth in the heart. What comes from within, it's not just the words, it's what's inside. It's that being a Jew inwardly, as Paul described it. That's what God's looking for. And I think by Jesus' definition, Nathanael kind of fits that bill. He is saying, here is a man who walks uprightly, works righteousness, speaks the truth in his heart. Jesus reminds us in the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That's pretty advanced to talk about Nathanael, but if he is indeed guileless, if he's pure in heart, he doesn't understand it yet, but he's seeing God as he faces Jesus. And then Nathanael brings it all back down to the earth. How do you know me? When you meet somebody for the first time, and he says some things that make you wonder, how do you know who I am? How do you know me? We're always kind of curious where people get their information. I remember helping with a funeral one time, and a grandson was there, and a little boy, but I knew his name, and I called him by name, and he said, how do you know me? Well, I want to say I did your parents' wedding ceremony, but that wouldn't have helped any. He didn't know that either. But how do you know me? I suppose that we would judge from Nathanael's question, he's inquisitive. He doesn't just take things as they are. He wants to know who, how. And so Jesus gives him an interesting explanation. Before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree. Now, Jesus says two things that are very important about Nathanael. One, he tells him, I know Philip called you. But even before he called you, I saw you when you were under the fig tree. Now that raises a really interesting image for us. What's this business about a fig tree? Well, in all those books that I have on the apostles, they all make a really good point about the fig tree, and we might as well explain it. Fig trees normally grew to a height of about 15 feet, but their width, with all of their limbs hanging down, could be as far as 25 feet wide. And remember that most of the houses in the time we're talking about, many of them were only one-room houses. There wasn't a whole lot of space. It was not uncommon for a family to have a fig tree just outside their house. It was an extra room for the house because the limbs hung down. It was a little interior place where you could go just to be yourself, to be quiet, or to study, or to pray, or to meditate. And Jesus said, I saw you under the fig tree. Now, the interesting angle on that is that supposedly you can't be seen under the fig tree because the leaves are so thick and they hang down so low. This is one of those early introductions to the omniscience of Jesus. He saw him in more ways than one. He saw him in a way that Nathanael might not yet understand. But I saw you under the fig tree. Nathanael is overwhelmed with that. And he responds with two very important statements about Jesus. He responds by saying, "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Now, by anybody's definition, that's a pretty good stretch to go from hearing Jesus say, "I saw you under the fig tree," you must be the Son of God. You must be the King of Israel. Much of what Jesus did and said helped to fulfill those definitions. He was indeed the Son of God. John will explain in chapter 20 of his book, many other signs and wonders did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. I didn't tell you everything, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing have life in his name. Well, that's exactly what Nathanael is coming to now. You are the Son of God. Philip had called him the son of Joseph. No, it's more than that. You are the Son of God. And you are the King of Israel. And he's been reading those prophets because they all talked about a coming king who was going to clear the people, clear the foreigners out of their land, was going to give them a new purpose, a new direction, new oversight, new guidance. I couldn't help thinking with the kind of privacy that's suggested with the fig tree, it would be a great place for the psalmist's words, "Be still and know that I'm God." We all need that kind of quiet place. We need to find that moment where we can be still and listen to God through his word, through his response to our prayers. What place is better for stillness than a fig tree? One writer from a few decades ago said, "What America needs is fewer 70-mile-an-hour sports cars and more rocking chairs." And then he added, in Nathanael's idiom, that means more fig trees. We need more places where we can be still and know that he is God. Well, let me suggest some lessons just from this part of Nathanael's story, and we'll get to the other part in a moment. First, I think we understand the value of Scriptures better. The Scriptures are emphasized in identifying Jesus. The Scriptures are fulfilled in Nathanael's confession, the Son of God, the King of Israel. The value of Scriptures. And if we believe that Nathanael may well have been studying the Scriptures under the fig tree, if we believe he is a student of the Scriptures, and I think there's evidence that he is, then that might have been a thing for him to do. And how appropriate. Jesus said, "I saw you there." Maybe he was in prayer. Been much the same thing. The value of Scriptures. But if he's in prayer, then he teaches us something about the power of prayer. Seeking insights. The Bible teaches us that there is a place to pray. Enter into your room, into your chamber, into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father in secret. And he who sees in secret will reward you openly. There is a place to pray for all of us. We need to find that place that works best for us. There's not only a place to pray, there's a time to pray. Daniel suggests 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. There's even a suggestion about a posture for prayer. In Jesus' parable about the publican and the Pharisee, or the Pharisee and the publican, the Pharisee stands thus with himself and prays. The publican will not so much as lift his head, but bows and says, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Posture indicates something about our allegiance to God, our submission to God. There's even a posture. And there's even a purpose to pray. Paul tells us to let your requests be made known to God, and he will reward you. Well, let's look at the second text. Not nearly as long and not nearly as full, but still very meaningful. John chapter 21. This passage has been talked about quite a bit recently. Scott preached on it a couple of weeks ago. And so here we are, John 21, the first 4 verses. After these things, that's after the resurrection, and Jesus began to appear to the disciples, and so he showed himself again, indicating this has been one in a series, to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way he showed himself. And then John simply said, here's how it happened. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, there it is, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we're going with you also. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. We've all talked about in this passage the fact that here's a group of men who are still trying to reestablish what's going on in their lives. They've spent 3 years building up to a very climactic moment, the death of Jesus, where it seemed it was all over. And then 3 days later, he was raised from the dead. And what does all this mean? And he's been talking about going away. And there's a sense of what happens to us. John identifies 5 people by name and adds 2 others. Would you like to know who those are? I don't know. But 7 men who've been together for some time. Notice the first name mentioned is Peter. He's always the first person mentioned in these groups. And Peter makes the announcement for the group. I am going fishing. It's easy to say, well, Peter wants to get back to his former profession. This is the way he'd made his living. If things are changing and the Lord's going away, I have to have something to do. Let's get back to fishing. The others all say, we're going with you, raising the possibility that they all had been fishermen at some point or another. Maybe not in the intensity of Peter and Andrew and James and John, where it was a business. But maybe Nathanael had been a fisherman too. And they say, we'll go with you. We understand the value of companionship. We understand the value of a group helping to counteract the loss of a single person. Each one of these men had lost something. As a group, they may be able to reestablish a contact that's important to them. And so they don't just go fishing. They fish all night and catch nothing. This, of course, is the second time in Jesus' ministry with the disciples where they fished all night and caught nothing. The first incident comes very early in his ministry, and he tells them to fish on the other side of the boat, and they brought in a great haul of fish. He does the same thing here. When he appears, sadly, they don't recognize him. Now, it's night. They're out on a boat in the water. He's on the land. Distance may fit it in here. They don't recognize him. You understand that we've just abbreviated this passage just to get Nathanael mentioned again. But the story is far more significant than that. It's when Jesus prepares a meal for them, invites them to come have breakfast with him. Is that where we got the idea that breakfast meetings may be the best of all? Invites them to come have breakfast with me. I used to go to the Pancake Pantry a lot in the morning. When Steve Flatt was president of Lipscomb, it was not unusual to see Steve Flatt and the president of Belmont having breakfast together at Pancake Pantry. I thought I was in pretty good company. An early breakfast meeting. And then that conversation between Jesus and Peter and the rest of these men just listening in. You wonder if they really understood what was going on. Peter did. Did they? That's what makes this chapter so very important. And we stop in the midst of it. We just have Peter standing on the shore, and they don't know it's Jesus. John is the one who announces it's the Lord. And Peter dashes off to him. So what do we derive from all of this? I'd like to say that there's a place in the company of men following Jesus. There's a place for the scholar. There's a place for the avid student. There's a place for the person constant in prayer. That's all terribly important. Nathaniel joins this group in their all-night outing, and we discover its purpose and its apparent failure, its surprise ending when Jesus comes. John does not follow this little group back from the sea into their own homes and on to pursuing the Great Commission that Jesus will give them, or going into all the world, preaching the gospel. John just stops it at this point. Somebody said in a bent and twisted world, to know God is to know one at least who understands. And I'd like to think that's something we derive from the study of Nathaniel. Nathaniel proves that God can take an obscure person from an obscure place and use that person for God's own glory. But he will do it only if we're willing to come and see. Thank you very much for being in our class this morning.